So good morning to all. I'm David Lay, professor here at Lund University, and I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting also on behalf of Lund University. Now, this first session promises to be extremely exciting. Our first speaker now this morning is Morten L Kringelbach, and he's a professor of neuroscience at the University of Oxford in the UK, also at Aarhus University in Denmark. You're also the director of the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing. Professor Kringelbach has made contributions to a range of topics within neuroscience using neuroimaging, deep brain stimulation, and whole brain modeling. And his research is focused on identifying processes in the human brain, enabling us to survive and thrive, specifically systems related to emotion, pleasure, and happiness, eudaimonia. So, Professor Kringelbach, very welcome.
How wonderful to be in Lund. And what a tough act to follow. What a wonderful woman Professor Els was. I'm here to talk to you about something which I think is natural and one of probably the most important sources of pleasure and flourishing in our lives, namely the social interactions with others, and specifically with infants. Just to remind you what that's like, let me just play you a short video.
Daddy's gonna make you laugh now. Ready?
Isn't that amazing? And it just goes on. I mean, it's perfect for a morning like this when things are a bit grey. I don't really want it to stop, but we have to do some science, yes? As my colleagues say in Oxford, they say, Morten, are you sure that's science? I am fairly certain that it's science, and I think it's the kind of thing that makes you get up every day. And really just to remind ourselves of what is going on here. I mean, I've been fascinated by how the brain works and how it is that we engage with things out there, how it grows into becoming glass half full rather than half empty. And just to remind for those of you who I'm sure have studied neurophysiology and the functions of the brain, if you look at the red bits, the blobs on there, those are the parts at the back of the brain. It's the brain seen from different angles, from the top, from the side, and straight on. And the red is where the visual cortex comes in, with the visual things that come to your eyes, and then it goes to the back of the brain. The dark blue is where hearing comes into the brain. The light blue is where the somatosensory system is. And then in orange and yellow, you get the smell and taste. So if I was an evil scientist, or you had a stroke, and part of the red areas went away, you would become blind, but you wouldn't become unemotional. You wouldn't become unconscious necessarily. And that's why I've written, just like in the old map makers, you know, in the old days when they had pictures of trying to draw out North America, they didn't quite know where things were, so they wrote, "Here be dragons," where they didn't know where things were. And as you can see on this map, there's a lot of white. There's a lot of places where things come together. So this talk really is about finding out how things come together in the brain and how it is that we come to make emotional decisions about those things. And those decisions are eventually emotional. When I showed this to one of my artists in my center, NIDCAP, he said, "Oh, Morten, we must make a set of sculptures," which immediately was something that is close to my heart because although I don't usually tell people this, I was also trained at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen growing up. I was fascinated by sculptures, and here you have 5 sculptures that basically is an instantiation of those blobs that you just saw in colors. So this, for instance, is the visual cortex, but without the rest of the brain, it's just a blob, right? But what is it that is going on? What is being computed in those blobs? And so it's really a story of hierarchy. So things come into your brain, and then you somehow have to make sense of it. And here I'm showing you the hierarchy of in the concentric rings. The outer ring is at the bottom, and in green you can see the visual cortex. Things comes into V1 and then it becomes more and more processed until eventually it gets to the inner circle. At that point it then gets information from, say, the auditory cortex, which is in blue. But really what I want to understand is what is going on when things come together. And so I have been inspired by Aristotle, as you've already heard from Stina. Hedonia is his word for pleasure. It comes from hedus, the sweet taste of honey, and it's really what is essential for our survival. Sex, of course, is important. Food is important. Social interactions are very important as well, as this conference really is about. How do we grow a brain? Aristotle also had the insight to say that there was something else going on. It's not just enough to survive. One also has to thrive. And eudaimonia, a life well lived, embedded in meaningful values, is what he was interested in. Eu meaning good, and daimonia meaning spirit, the good spirit. It's very difficult to measure reliably. It's very difficult to, unlike I can give you sugar water and I can make you feel good about the sugar water, it's much harder to make you feel meaningful and flourishing. But social interaction, especially with babies, is one of the ways. Another way into it would be things like meditation and psychedelics and music. So initially my career started on focusing on the easy of the two problems, namely what is it about pleasure? Because of course, if something goes wrong with that, like it has gone fairly wrong this morning, because as I woke up in the hotel, there was a bit like Danish coffee, you know, the poor talk, the kind of black thing that is called coffee, which is not really coffee. And so I'm right now in a state of wanting. I'm over here, I'm thinking about how I can get a good cup of coffee. And I know there's great coffee here in Sweden, because yesterday I had the joy of walking around Lund and had some fantastic coffee. And some fantastic fikan also, which was wonderful. So I'm sort of stuck in this phase over here. I'm wanting things. And eventually I will have a good cup of coffee and I'll be liking things. And eventually I'll be able to go back to talking to you. I also know that it's socially unacceptable for me to run out of the auditorium and get a good cup of coffee. So I have learned things in the past. So really, understanding that cycle, which goes on all the time, and coffee is just one of the many things that can start and go through that cycle. I've worked with this man, Ken Barrich, and Kent is a real pioneer. He studied, amongst other things, newborn babies. He gave them sugar water, and have a look at that baby there, licking its lips to the sugar water, trying to suck up as much sugar as possible. Similar things happen in rats, as you can see, and what his PhD students do is they basically measure how many times they lick their lips as a direct measure of how pleasurable things are. Now the cool thing about that is that you would have thought that pleasure, oh, by the way, by the yin and there's the yang, here's something bitter, beer for instance, although Danish kids learn that from early age, they should be the other way around. It's quite painful, isn't it? Really. But the same thing happens in rats. But it means now that he then was able to have a brain model for finding out how things work in the rodent brain. And through his amazing work that he did mostly covertly, because no funding agency would be foolish enough to give him this money, but he did it anyway, like most good things in life. He discovered that there was a difference between wanting and liking. There's a difference about the orchestration in my brain when I want this coffee and when I actually like it. And he discovered that when I like things, there's a part of your brain, the nucleus accumbens, the medial shell of the nucleus accumbens, which is what you see here, both located in the brain, but also a close-up of this part. And you can see there's some red and some blue bobs. And I call them the dimmer switches, because it turns out that if you stimulate these either with neurotransmitters, specifically with opioids, you can turn up and down how many times the rat will lick its lips. It's kind of crazy, right, that it's like that. You can also optically, genetically store this. You can take it out, and then you discover that, unfortunately, that poor animal becomes anhedonic and unable to feel pleasure again. So he has identified this, and I, with my own little sort of neurophrenology scanner, have tried to look at what happens in the brains of people when they have food or social interactions, even when they take methamphetamines. These are drug-naive undergraduates taking crystal meth. This was before Breaking Bad, and it was surprisingly easy to get ethical permission for this. But In humans, it's slightly different, although it's, as we'll see in a moment, it's also quite similar to rats. But one of the things that happens in humans is that we have something called the orbital frontal cortex, which is very much developed in higher primates like humans. And it's the part of the brain that is just over your eyeballs, hence the name orbit, meaning eyeballs. And because, as part of my doctorate back in the 90s, I was able to get good signal from this region. I was able to basically tell a great story about what this part of the brain does for humans. And it turns out that it does many things, as we'll see in a moment, but it's really part of who we are. This is also why I'm on a mission to make sure that Scandinavians wear cycle helmets. I'm shocked to see that here in Sweden you do exactly the same stupid things as people do in Denmark, namely not wear a helmet, because what happens when you have a fall, you don't have to be hit by anything, is that you basically, your brain will start to vibrate as you fall, and then the part that will be mostly damaged is your orbital frontal cortex. And that's not good, because that basically stops you from having a full life, a thriving life, if you don't die from the impact anyway. So anyway, wear helmets. So in humans and in rats, we have this circuitry. This is the liking phase, and you can see how it is in the rat brain, and notice how I've enlarged the rat brain because, of course, it's no larger than my thumb. What happens is that there's a number of different regions in what I call the pleasure engine. There's the nucleus accumbens, as we already talked about. There's another part called the ventral pallidum. There are many parts here that work together to get the experience and making sure you can feel pleasure. And in humans, we've had a similar kind of circuit, although we can't really do what we do to rats. And together with a philosopher, Roger Crisp, who's also an advisor to my center, we've discovered that it doesn't really matter whether you have sugar water or you're listening to Bach. It's the same kind of circuit. What is very different, of course, is the kind of flourishing, the meaning-making that you make out of it afterwards. So this is a small video of my center in Oxford, which I would encourage you to come and visit when you can. It's quite rare to have that larger building. It's not all mine, but the white part is. And in this building, we try to really move on from just thinking about pleasure, to actually think about what it's like to flourish, to thrive. And what's unusual about the center, which has also been slightly unusual about my career, is that we are very interested in being interdisciplinary. So not only do we have neuroscientists, philosophers, some doctors, physicists and anthropologists and artists, but we really want to find out what it is that makes for a meaningful life. And as part of that, we have 5 main strands. We have the sensorium, foods and other things that you feel with your senses. We have the nurturance, which is what I'll be talking about today. What is it like to actually have these wonderful little kids? There's music, there's psychedelics, there's meditation, and they're all bound together by something that I call whole brain modeling. Now, what is extraordinary, and this is where I become quite geeky, is that we can actually build models of these data that we get from neuroimaging. We can take the data we get out of a neuroimaging scanner, and we can build a computational model that we can then probe, just like you would probe an animal model, just like Kent would take things out in his model and show that you could lick your lips more or less. We can do exactly the same in these whole brain models. In other words, we have a way of going beyond just having blobs, but think about how it is that the brain changes dynamically over time. So that's kind of exciting. I'm blessed with a great center advisory board. Again, as you can see from what they do, is that they have many different kind of skills. And I have a fairly large team of people that are all kind of coming from different points. But the key thing here is that they have to work together and they have to fulfill what I call the KFC formula. Now, for many of you, KFC means Kentucky Fried Chicken, which of course they have to fulfill as well. But the key KFC for us is kindness, fun, and curiosity. And notice it's not clever, but it's curious, because I think being curious is probably the most important thing that one can be when one is trying to investigate things. And then we also have these wonderful artists in residence. Milton Mamakidis has the title that I really want, namely professor of jazz guitar at the Royal College of Music, but he's also somebody who I work very closely with. Tim Flack is a photographer, and Lizzie Burns is somebody who's very interested in something that is much underrated, namely boredom. And she set up a charity to see whether she can alleviate boredom, and especially in hospitals. I think that's something that is extremely important. And Annie, you've already seen with our sculptures. Just to remind you of the kind of things that Tim does, he does these amazing portraits of animals, fireflies, a bit like the brain in the middle, but then also some very cute animals. Even, surprisingly, a bat can be cute if you photograph it in the right way. So yes, meaning making is what we're after. I've already told you a bit about the kind of things that we're interested in, and let me just very briefly, before we get to the cute critters, let's talk about how it is that one makes these models. This is my friend Gustavo Deco, and yes, especially in winter, everybody needs a friend in Barcelona, where the sun seems to be shining all the time, which is a bit disconcerting really, because that tells us something about global warming, but the coffee is good, as you can see. The kind of thing we do is probably not something that you are particularly excited about, but I happen to be very excited about. It is to look at the kind of complex dynamics of something like the zebrafish, and look at how it is that it's got these critical moments. You'll see in a moment that the whole brain lights up. These are all the neurons in the zebrafish brain. How does one explain that kind of criticality in the brain? It turns out that there are many great ways of doing that using physics and mathematics, and that's exactly what we've done and what makes us probably very different from anybody else. And by doing that, we can then identify who are basically on top of the hierarchy. What are the elder wise women, as I call them, that run the show? What are the wise women at the top of the brain that makes you be able to do things in the right way? Other people don't call them elderly wise women, but call them the global workspace. And there's lots of theories about what that does for consciousness and other things. And we decided we wanted to find them. So we took the data from 1,000 adults, and we used these kind of methods that I won't bore you with today, but you can read all about it in our publication in Nature Human Behavior, where we basically worked out for 7 different tasks and for resting in these 1,000 people, who are sitting at the top. We know where things are coming in. We know when they're doing different tasks and what is common to all of these. And then we built a model, and like a multi-headed hydra, we cut out the top of the hierarchy and show that the model no longer works. We cut out the lower parts and we show that it still works. That tells us who is in charge of the machine. And it turns out, as you can read in this paper, that the parts, the elderly wise women of the brain, are sitting both in the precuneus, in the midstream, and deep in the subcortical layers. And if you look at the development of the infant brain, these are some of the first areas that come on. Notice also, and this got us into quite a bit of trouble, we didn't find the prefrontal cortex there. That makes sense, because the prefrontal cortex perhaps is not necessary, but certainly something that enhances our experience. At the same time, having a prefrontal cortex is also something that leads to what I call the tragic miracle of consciousness. And I'm borrowing here from John Steinbeck, the Nobel Prize winner. This idea that we are constantly bound up to this past that we can't change, and this future that never may come to pass, and we forget to be here. And in your practices with the babies, you know the importance of the now. So could one do the same thing as we just did, and I just showed how it works for consciousness? Could one look at flourishing experiences and look at what is common to all of those things? That's certainly the idea, and that's certainly what we want to do. But I can hear you say, what about those babies? Just to remind ourselves how fun babies can be.
Hi, girls.
Look at this.
It's August 6th. Is that right?
Yeah.
August 6th, 2012. Daddy's going to play them a little song while they're eating their peas.
Notice how there's a competing thing. There's music and then there's food, right? And notice how they're looking at each other. And now suddenly the food. Oh, yes. Dancing is good, but food is important, yes? Isn't that wonderful? And it tells you how much joy one can get out of those. And it means that even if you, like this baby, have grown up in a kitchen sink that is half full, life can still be half full, yes? So children are vulnerable, I don't need to tell you that. But I do need to tell you that I'm sure you know that the long-term mental health of those babies can be compromised if you haven't got the right kind of dyadic interactions. And even minor things like cleft palates can be a major problem later on. As we will hear later in this conference, as I'm sure you know all about, building a break takes nurture. and we are starting to get much better data on what is actually going on as that is being built. What I'm going to tell you about now is not so much about how the human brain is being built, but how it is that we interact with that. What is happening in the caregiver's brains as we do that. How we try, and at the top, this is from a recent review of ours, we can see how you get the sort of kind of statistical learning to learning language and hearing things, and why it is, for instance, I'm sure you know this, you probably struggle with the Danish language, which is why I'm speaking to you in English and not some kind of potato in the mouth, as you say in Swedish. Why is it, for instance, that Danish kids are 2 years delayed compared to both Norwegians and Swedish people in order to actually understand what other people are saying? It's probably because they're dumber, but it could also be that there's something inherently difficult about the Danish language. At the same time, the bottom part here about how it is that we orient things, how the baby orients, recognizes, and how intuitive parenting, mentioned in the previous talks, is very, very important, and how that provides a base for both the attachment and the intersubjectivity and the higher order functions that come on in the first 18 months. But this really requires 3 things. It requires the parental focus of attention, it requires emotional scaffolding, and it requires a capacity for sensitive responsiveness. You know all about these. I'm just going to focus on the parental focus of attention because of this man, Konrad Lorenz, Nobel Prize winner, for his discovery of the fact that if you show yourself to geese during the first half hour before they're born, they think you're their mother. So here's the bearded man, the bearded mother, in the pond with his 2 kids. He also came up with the idea that maybe something happens to all species, that we like the neonatology of those faces. And somebody in America must have been listening, because you can tell how Mickey Mouse went from being quite a nasty little rodent to be a very cute kind of rodent. And in fact, for those of you who like manga like I do, you can see there's something about the big eyes and the proportions of the face that makes things very cute. In fact, you've probably seen one of these. This is a photos of Tim's as well. This is a wonderful axolotl, which is one of the most cute animals out there. But you also will have known that one can actually make objective measures of cuteness. You can measure the proportions of the face, and you can come up and take a database like the one we have in my lab, and you can show that even though they're both very cute, the one on the left is slightly less cute than the one on the right. And again, I'm not sure whether it's because of the cross-eyedness of the one on your right, but it really is very cute baby, yes. And they can then ask yourself, what happens if you ask people to look at the wanting and the liking? You ask people, how much do you like? How much do you like this particular? How attractive do you find these? And you get them to look at all these faces and you rate them for attractiveness. And then you also, because a lot of people have problems with actually being truthful about these things, especially if you're a man, it's not okay to tell how much you like babies. So we get them to do a wanting task. We get them to basically look at the face, and then there's a thermometer slowly going down, and you can then press expend work to make sure that it stays for longer. And nobody knows how much you press because you can't really see that. So it's probably a more truthful measure of how much you actually want that baby. And when you do that, first of all, you get what everybody knows, namely that men don't like babies. Yes. So you can see the blue line here means that men consistently rate babies less cute than women. But they are clearly sensitive to how cute they are. It's just that they don't want to admit it. Yes. Because in fact, if you look at them, how much work they'll do, they do exactly the same as women. And that's pretty good, right? Because otherwise we'd be in trouble as a species if men didn't like babies. And in fact, if you then look at what happens when men like babies, what happens in their brains where they don't have to tell us anything. But we just created this battery of adult faces and baby faces, and we had people go into an advanced hairdryer called an MEG scanner, which I'm happy to say that you've now also got one in Sweden. It was invented by our Finnish brothers. And a lot of my work has really been using this because what's special about it, apart from drying its hair really, really nicely, it's a very expensive one though, I wouldn't recommend it, you also are able to basically catch and show how information flows through the babies at the rate of 1,000th of a second. So that's pretty cool because it means that you can get things moving and you can tell what happens. And when this happened back in the 2000s, when I suddenly discovered that, of course, you get activity in the fusive phase form area, which is the part that is processing faces. If you have a lesion in that, if you have a stroke, like in Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, that basically means you're unable to see faces. So when you see both an infant and an adult face, after about 130 milliseconds, you get activity in this region. Great, there's a face out there. But what really was surprising, and that's what you see in the red blobs at the top left, you can see how the medial orbitofrontal cortex, that region that I've shown is involved in emotion in so many other experiments, came online at 130 milliseconds. And initially I thought it was a bug. I thought there was something wrong. But it turns out that consistently in our hands, not just to the way baby looks, but also with the sound, this is the part of your brain that tells you, wow, something is happening, I better pay attention. And so that's kind of useful. And it's useful that it happens because this is all done in adults that are not yet parents. It's very useful because that means that we will actually take care not only of our own babies, but of all babies. But it also means that if there's something slightly wrong with the face, and there's only about 1 or 2% of the face that is different, it doesn't fit the template. And that means, as you can see from these graphs, that suddenly the brain is much less precise in actually getting this particular thing happening, this activity in the orbitofrontal cortex. And so one of the things we've learned from these studies that we've done is that we need to work with the parents because, of course, these days, most of the time, we know before birth whether there will be a cleft lip, and we can mitigate that. Because, of course, they are equally cute, and we've shown in data collected from midwives and from surgeons and from nurses that when they look at these babies, they actually have the cuteness response because they've gotten used to it. They've changed their template. And so the hope is that we can do something very similar with kids, with people that become parents. But of course, there is just one thing that I would leave you with, because we are getting towards the end now, and that is this idea of, well, first of all, the idea of orphanages. As one of my good friends, von Eisendorf, says, there should not be orphanages, full stop. I mean, we should not allow this to happen because it's really about individualized care. But it does happen. This is a famous photo by Sebastião Salgado, this amazing Brazilian photographer from São Paulo, and it kind of shows the craziness of it. But you will also know, and this is a classic paper from Heckman and L, that the return on investment, if we do things to infants, the earlier we do them, we can do it for much less and have a much larger impact. And so one of the things I've been very excited by and have been very close to my heart is to do something about postnatal depression. Here's a review, one of our highest sizes reviews from 2011, where we show the rate of postnatal depression prevalence in developing countries. In countries like ours, it's about 10 to 13%, both in men and women. I mean, we've had to fight for this, but the data is very clear that men get postnatal depression as well. But as you can see in red, these are places where there's up to 30 to 50%. There should be parents that are suffering from postnatal depression because, of course, if you don't treat the diet, if you don't do something about that, there are kids that are growing up to see that life is half empty. And it's so easy to actually do caregiver interventions where you can help parents to focus on these cues, to think about what the infant is communicating and respond appropriately. Again, work from Van Eisendorn and from my very good friend Alan Stein with the video camera on the baby and on the parent, usually in a situation that is difficult, usually around feeding. One of the things that happens, as I'm sure you will have seen, is that the parent just takes it as a very functional kind of thing. And by the way, why is it that, especially in Scandinavia, that we regard food as so functional? It shouldn't be functional. It's joy. It's probably as joyful as life gets, right? And so sharing that with the baby. But the problem, of course, is that she's just stuffing food into them because she knows that she has to do that. But now, if you then have a camera both on the baby and on the mother, you can then sit with her afterward and say, did you notice how your baby smiled? And the mother goes, no, my baby never smiles. It's not part of his repertoire. And yet, because you can show the photo, you now know, and she will now be looking for it. And doing these little interventions turns out to have a real kind of possibility of change. And so in this trial from Kailica, which is one of those terrible places near Cape Town, full of poverty, but also joy, or the potential for joy, you can do that. You can train local community workers and basically try to make a difference. And this is the work of Alan Stein, where he basically showed that by doing a randomized control trial, and imagine the kind of problems of doing a randomized control trial that gets into the BMJ, to actually do this and make sure that you can recruit, that you can help these women, and you can then show by using therapists of doing the whole kind of thing. It's difficult, but it's important. And once you have these local women trained, once it's a bit like in the Bible, you know, you can of course give people fish, but if you teach them how to fish, it's much more important. And in this particular trial, they show that both the infant attachment, this is just the Ainsworth 18-month one, is much better, but more importantly, the adult depression also helps. So I think it's time that we do something about this. I think it's time that we actually try to see whether we can develop, and again, informed by the neuroscience, informed by the kind of things that we now know is going on in the caregiver's mind, and try to see if we can understand that dance, that choreography, that naturalness of not leaving anyone behind. And so yes, flourishing states are now able to be identified. To have flourishing, we need a working hedonic system. If that's no longer working, then we can forget about thriving. And we can use neuroimaging, and we can try to find out what are the true, not just wise, but thriving old women at the top of the hierarchy. And just to remind ourselves again of what kind of things could be done. And when I was introduced, said that I worked on deep brain stimulation. It's true, but I don't think it's for everyone. I think the real true deep brain stimulation is about other people and the kind of things that they do, and this is one of the things that I think again helps me on a grey Monday morning.
Jerusalem, ikhaya lami, ilondoloze, uhambe nami, zungangishilana.
Oh my God. They just go on and on. As another obsession of mine is groove, but that would be another talk for another day. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was really a tremendous start to this day. I think probably most people are occupied with translating what you described to the scenario of probably extremely preterm birth, what we experience, how we interact, and neurodevelopmental follow-up. So while we're waiting for questions to arrive on the internet, the floor is yours. Questions, thoughts, ideas. There's one. Yeah.
You get the golden microphone.
My name is Nick Korneman. Thank you for such an amazing talk, and it's very inspiring. I'm working in the field of developmental care, and one of my biggest questions is, how do I motivate, or how can I help caregivers to open up their brains to subtle behaviors of prematurely born infants, so that they can follow the infant and be with the infant in synchrony and balance, and in a NICU. So that's sort of my life's work, and I thought it was empathy at first, and then I thought you need safety, and then, but how do you do it?
Well, I think joy is at the center of that. I think it all starts with these hardwired responses that we have. Mm-hmm. I think nature in that sense has been very clever in that, and I don't know if you, like me, like puppies and kittens as well. It turns out if you study our brains as we engage with those puppy and kittens, we think they are babies. Within the first 200 milliseconds, we think, oh God, there's another baby. And only then do we realize it's not. And by then it's too late. We've already opened ourselves up to them, and we get that kind of warm, fuzzy feeling. So I think one of the ways to do it is to turn up the channels that allows that joy to happen. Anybody who's worked with infants who are in incubators will see that we're not allowed to smell them, we're not allowed to hear them, all those kind of things. If we can somehow perhaps increase those kind of signals, because those are the kind of signals that opens our brains up to the possibility of joy and the possibility of then opening up for the empathy and these higher order systems. But you really got to engage that system to start with.
And how do you overcome the fear of caregivers that they get emotionally involved with their patients in a system that has always sort of said, don't get involved?
Yes. Yeah, I should divulge that growing up, my grandfather was a pediatrician, and Danish pediatrician. I always wanted to be like him. But sadly, he was one of those of the generation where he got too involved with his kids. So he became a very unhappy man, because of course, if you work as a pediatrician in a hospital and you're the main consultant, you see a lot of kids dying. And so in the end, I decided not to become a doctor for that very reason. But I think some of you probably have that possibility. How does one make that kind of leap, but both being involved, but also keeping a distance? I knew that I couldn't do it, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't.
I call it professional closeness.
Mm-hmm. But that's the word, right? The professional.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear more about what that means.
We have a question from Ulla Andersson. I warn you, it could be related to delayed cord clamping. I don't know.
Oh. No, but it was actually a follow-up of this question, because you talk about the stimulants, but isn't the problem the inhibitors? I think that's quite a lot of maturing, being mature, is to inhibit a lot of the positive feelings, and also in the parents that they are inhibited. Do you have any research on the inhibition mechanisms we all struggle with?
Yeah, I've been very interested in this, because it turns out that one of the main problems, and let's just think about this as a computational problem. If you think about how it is that information gets from one neuron to another, it takes about 10 to 30 milliseconds. Any of the phones that you have on your bodies right now, it takes nanoseconds. So the signals is very, very slow in the brain. And so how do we actually solve things? How do we do things in a critical way when we only have about 200 milliseconds to actually react in the right way? And it turns out that the main way that the brain solves this is by having emotions. So it's kind of strange that we then spend a lot of our time then actually inhibiting those emotions, showing ourselves that we shouldn't have those emotions, when in fact this is the very reason that we're able to survive in the first place, that we're able to do things in the actual world. And so I'm very interested in exactly what it is and why it is that it's become socially acceptable to try to inhibit those emotions, when in fact they are something that, or at least some of them, should not be inhibited. It's also kind of interesting, and not just talking about inhibiting, but a lot of life is really about the negative emotions. If you think about the main emotions, and there are lots of discussions about whether there are 7 or 9 or 10 or whatever, how many emotions, but they're almost exclusively negative. Anger, hate, all those kind of things. But there's only really one that is positive, joy, and yet is the only one that gets you up in the morning. It's not the fear of no longer being able to do something that gets you up or do crazy things. It's the hope that today there will be some joy. And this, of course, is why my center is about thriving, because I think that's the only game in town. There are no end of people throughout my career that have told me that this is not worth doing. It hasn't got the gravitas of deep chronic pain. Of course it doesn't. But one cannot exist without the other. And in particular, I don't think we would do anything unless we tried this.
Thank you very much, Morten.
Thank you.
A round of applause, please.
Wonderful, thank you.